A cloud of dust billowed behind the lone rider as he made his way across the arid plains of Wyoming Territory in 1875, his weathered face betraying years of hardship and the weight of memories too painful to voice. Levi Northwood had spent the last decade drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs at ranches across the frontier, never staying long enough to form attachments or resurrect the dreams that had died alongside his wife and unborn child during a harsh winter 7 years prior. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape as Levi spotted the small settlement of Promise Creek in the distance. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Penny, whinnied softly as if sensing they would find rest soon. Levi patted her neck gently. "Just a little further, girl. We'll get you some water and oats soon enough." Promise Creek wasn't much a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, including a general store, a saloon, a small church, and scattered residences. It was the kind of place Levi typically avoided, preferring the solitude of open ranges and cattle drives. But winter was approaching, and he needed steady work to see him through the cold months ahead. As he rode into town, the commotion near the church caught his attention. A small crowd had gathered, their voices raised in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Curiosity got the better of him, and Levi guided Penny toward the scene. "We simply cannot keep her here indefinitely," a stern-faced woman was saying. "The orphanage in Cheyenne is the proper place for a child without parents." "But Miss Finch, it's a 3-day journey," protested an elderly man, "and winter's coming on fast." Levi dismounted, tying Penny to a nearby post. As he approached, he caught sight of a small figure sitting on the church steps, clutching a worn rag doll. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a dirty face streaked with tear tracks. Something about the child's forlorn expression tugged at him in a way nothing had for years. "What's happening here?" Levi asked, addressing no one in particular. A man in a black coat, presumably the preacher, turned to him. "Tragedy, I'm afraid. The Wilkins family was found 2 days ago, their wagon overturned at Crooked Creek Crossing. Both parents drowned." He lowered his voice. "Little girl survived somehow, been staying with the church, but we're not equipped for long-term care of a child." Levi nodded, his gaze drawn back to the girl. Her eyes, large and blue, met his briefly before she looked away. "Sheriff's arranged for her to go to the orphanage in Cheyenne," continued the preacher. "Just waiting on someone heading that way to take her along." "And no family?" Levi asked, though he already knew the answer. "None that we know of. They were settlers passing through, heading to Oregon." The discussion continued around him, but Levi found himself walking toward the child. He crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "Hello there," he said softly. The girl looked up, studying him with a wariness beyond her years. She didn't speak. "My name's Levi." "What's yours?" After a long pause, she whispered, "Freya." "That's a mighty pretty name, Freya. Is that your doll?" She nodded, clutching the raggedy thing closer to her chest. "Her name is Sadie." "Well, it's nice to meet both you and Sadie." The tension in the girl's shoulders eased slightly. Levi was about to ask another question when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see a young woman with auburn hair and kind eyes. "She hasn't spoken that much to anyone since she got here," the woman said softly. "I'm Faith Ramsey, the school teacher." Levi stood, tipping his hat politely. "Levi Northwood, madam, just passing through." "Well, Mr. Northwood, you seem to have a way with children." She glanced at Freya with concern. "It's been difficult finding someone willing to make the journey to Cheyenne with winter coming." Before Levi could respond, Freya suddenly spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked, looking up at him with those haunting blue eyes. Levi smiled gently. "I suppose I am, in a manner of speaking. I work with cattle and horses." "My papa told me stories about cowboys," she said, a flicker of animation crossing her face. "He said they're brave and strong." "Your papa was right," Levi replied, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. Faith knelt beside the girl. "Freya, it's getting cold. Why don't we go inside and get you some supper?" As Faith reached for her hand, Freya suddenly scrambled to her feet and grabbed Levi's worn leather coat with surprising strength. "Can you pretend to be my daddy?" she whispered desperately. "Just for a little while, please." The simple plea hit Levi like a physical blow. A flood of emotions, grief, longing, and something else he couldn't name washed over him. To his horror, he felt tears welling in his eyes, the first he'd shed since burying his wife. He blinked rapidly, but not before Faith noticed. "Freya, that's not appropriate," Faith said gently, though her eyes remained fixed on Levi's face with newfound interest. Levi cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "It's all right," he managed. "No harm done." But as he looked down at the desperate hope in Freya's eyes, something shifted inside him as if a door long sealed had cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. He knelt down again, meeting her gaze. "I can't pretend to be your daddy, Freya," he said softly. "That wouldn't be honest. But I can be your friend if you'd like." Disappointment clouded her features, but she nodded solemnly. Levi stood, aware of the crowd dispersing around them as the excitement faded. The preacher approached. "Miss Ramsey has kindly been looking after Freya during the day, but we're stretched thin for overnight care," he explained. "Sheriff's sending a telegram to Cheyenne tomorrow." Levi nodded, his mind working. "I might be staying in town for a spell, looking for winter work." "The Robertson Ranch is hiring," Faith offered quickly. "They lost 2 hands to gold fever last month." "Is that so?" Levi replied, noticing how the fading sunlight caught the copper highlights in her hair. "I'll look into it. Thank you, Miss Ramsey." "Faith, please," she corrected with a small smile. That night, as Levi lay on a rented bed at the boarding house, he couldn't shake the image of Freya's pleading eyes or the feeling of her tiny hands clutching his coat. Sleep eluded him as memories he'd long suppressed resurfaced, the excitement of learning his wife was expecting, the plans they'd made, the nursery he'd begun building before the fever took them both. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring resolve. After a quick breakfast, Levi rode out to the Robertson Ranch and secured employment for the winter. By midday, he was back in town, standing before the preacher's door with an unexpected proposition. "I'd like to take the girl to Cheyenne myself," he said when the preacher answered. "I know the route well." The preacher studied him with surprise. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Northwood, but it's a considerable undertaking." "I understand, but I've got the means to travel safely, and the child seems comfortable with me." After some discussion and a meeting with the sheriff, it was arranged. Levi would depart with Freya in 2 days' time once proper documentation was prepared. What he didn't share was the growing certainty that he couldn't simply deliver the child to an orphanage and ride away. Faith arrived as the details were being finalized, her expression a mixture of relief and concern when she learned of the plan. "You're doing a kind thing, Mr. Northwood," she said when they stepped outside, "but I worry about Freya. She's already lost so much." "I know what that's like," Levi replied, more openly than he'd intended. "And please call me Levi." Faith studied him thoughtfully. "Would you join us for lunch? Freya's waiting at the schoolhouse, and it might help her understand what's happening." The small schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a modest building with a single room and a bell tower. Inside, Freya sat alone at a desk, drawing with a pencil stub on a scrap of paper. She looked up when they entered, her face brightening at the sight of Levi. "You came back," she exclaimed with more animation than he'd seen from her yet. "I did," he confirmed, taking a seat beside her. "What are you drawing?" She turned the paper toward him. It showed 3 stick figures, a tall one with a hat, a smaller one with long hair, and a tiny figure between them. "It's you and Miss Faith and me," she explained. Levi exchanged a glance with Faith, who was unpacking a modest lunch from her basket. Her cheeks had colored slightly. Over bread, cheese, and apples, Levi explained to Freya that they would be traveling together to a place called Cheyenne. He carefully avoided mentioning the orphanage, unable to bring himself to extinguish the hope that had returned to her eyes. "Will Miss Faith come too?" Freya asked, looking between them. Faith shook her head gently. I need to stay and teach the other children, sweetheart. Disappointment flashed across Freya's face. But you could teach me too. Perhaps, Faith said kindly, I could prepare some lessons for you to take on your journey. This seemed to satisfy Freya, who returned to her apple. Levi found himself watching Faith, noticing the gentle way she interacted with the child and the quiet strength she radiated. Something about her reminded him of Clara, his late wife, not in appearance but in spirit. As the meal concluded, Faith walked them to the door. I'll help gather supplies for your journey, she offered. Freya will need warm clothes and provisions. I'd appreciate that, Levi replied. I'm not exactly versed in caring for a little girl, Faith smiled. Few men are until they learn. She hesitated, then added, Levi, what happens when you reach Cheyenne? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to voice. I'm still figuring that out, he admitted quietly. The next day passed in a flurry of preparations. Levi arranged for a small covered wagon, reasoning it would provide better shelter than traveling on horseback. Faith and several women from the church contributed clothing, blankets, and supplies. Throughout it all, Freya followed Levi like a shadow, watching his every move with a mixture of hope and fear, as if expecting him to vanish. That evening, Faith invited them both to dinner at her small cabin near the schoolhouse. The modest home was warm and inviting, filled with books and simple, handmade furnishings. For the first time since her parents' death, Freya laughed as Levi told stories about a stubborn mule he'd once worked with named Ferdinand. As Freya nodded off by the fire after the meal, Faith and Levi spoke in hushed tones. You're good with her, Faith observed, pouring him a cup of coffee. Levi shook his head. I don't know about that. She just latched onto the first friendly face she saw. I don't think so, Faith countered. I've seen how she watches you. There's trust there. She hesitated. May I ask you something personal? At his nod, she continued. The way you reacted when she asked you to pretend to be her father, you've known loss too, haven't you? Levi stared into his coffee cup, surprised to find himself wanting to answer. My wife, Clara, and our unborn child, 7 years ago this winter. Faith's hand found his across the table, her touch gentle but steady. I'm so sorry, Levi. I've never told anyone that, he admitted. Not in years. Sometimes the right listener comes along when we're finally ready to speak, she said softly. Their eyes met, and Levi felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood grief and resilience. The moment was broken when Freya stirred, mumbling in her sleep. Faith moved to cover her with a blanket, her tenderness evident in every gesture. And you? Levi asked when she returned. What keeps a woman like you in a small town like Promise Creek? Faith's smile was tinged with sadness. I came west after losing my parents to influenza. Teaching was the only skill I had. 3 years later, I'm still here. She looked around her small home. These children, this community, they've become my family. As the evening drew to a close, Levi carried a sleeping Freya back to the boarding house, where the landlady had prepared a small cot in his room. Setting the child down gently, he was struck by how quickly she had come to matter to him. The thought of delivering her to strangers in Cheyenne now seemed impossible. But what was the alternative? A drifting cowboy with no home and painful memories was hardly father material. And yet, as he watched Freya sleep, clutching her rag doll, he couldn't deny the protective instinct growing within him. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold. Levi loaded the last of their supplies into the wagon while Freya said goodbye to Faith, who had come to see them off. The schoolteacher knelt before the child, pressing a small package into her hands. This is a journal, Faith explained. You can practice your letters and draw pictures of everything you see on your journey. Freya hugged her fiercely. Will I see you again? Faith's eyes flickered to Levi before she answered. I hope so, sweetheart. When it was time to leave, Levi helped Freya onto the wagon seat beside him. As he took the reins, he was surprised to feel Faith's hand on his arm. Levi, she said quietly, whatever you decide in Cheyenne. Follow your heart, He nodded, unable to find the right words. With a flick of the reins, they set off, Freya waving enthusiastically to Faith until the town disappeared from view. The journey to Cheyenne would take 3 days in good weather. Levi set a steady pace, mindful of the child beside him who alternated between silent observation and bursts of questions about everything they passed. By midday, he found himself pointing out plant life and animal tracks, drawing on knowledge he'd accumulated through years on the frontier. "Were you always a cowboy?" Freya asked as they shared a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack. "No," Levi replied. "I was a carpenter once back in Missouri." "Did you build houses?" "I did, and furniture too." Freya considered this. "Could you build a dollhouse for Sadie?" The innocent question caught him off guard. "Maybe someday," he found himself saying. As the first day of travel drew to a close, Levi made camp near a small creek. He showed Freya how to gather kindling for the fire, impressed by her eagerness to help. After a supper of beans and bacon, they sat side by side, watching the flames dance in the gathering darkness. "My mama and papa are in heaven now," Freya said suddenly, her voice small but clear. Levi nodded, unsure how to respond. "Miss Faith says they're watching over me," she continued. "Do you think that's true?" "I believe it is," Levi said, thinking of Clara. "The people we love never really leave us." Freya leaned against him, her small body warm against his side. "I'm scared sometimes," she confessed. "When it gets dark." Levi put his arm around her. "That's natural. Everyone gets scared sometimes. Even cowboys," he smiled, "especially cowboys. Will you stay with me so I'm not scared?" The question pierced him. "I'll stay with you tonight," he promised, knowing it wasn't enough but unable to offer more yet. The second day brought colder weather and overcast skies. Levi kept Freya close, wrapped in blankets as they traveled. She fell asleep against him shortly after noon, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Looking down at her peaceful face, Levi was struck by how quickly he'd become accustomed to her presence, and how empty the thought of continuing his journey without her felt. That night, as snow began to fall lightly, they took shelter in an abandoned line shack. Levi built a fire in the small stove and prepared their supper while Freya explored the single-room structure with curiosity. "Is this like your house?" she asked, running her hand along a rough-hewn table. "I don't have a house," Levi admitted. "Not anymore," Freya frowned. "Where do you live?" "Here and there, wherever I find work." She considered this, her young mind grappling with the concept, but everyone needs a home. The simple truth in her words struck him deeply. 7 years of drifting suddenly seemed like a wasted lifetime. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "everyone does." After Freya fell asleep, Levi sat by the stove, staring into the flames. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one with roots and purpose. The image that formed included not just Freya, but Faith as well, her gentle smile and quiet strength becoming as central to his vision as the child who had so unexpectedly captured his heart. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a thin white blanket across the landscape. They set out early, Levi anxious to reach Cheyenne before weather worsened. As the miles passed, his mind wrestled with decisions he'd never anticipated making. Late in the afternoon of the third day, the outskirts of Cheyenne came into view. Levi felt Freya tense beside him. "Is that where we're going?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," he answered. "That's Cheyenne." "What happens when we get there?" Levi pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her. "Freya, there's something I need to tell you. In Cheyenne, there's a place called an orphanage. It's where children go when they don't have parents to look after them." Her eyes widened with understanding and fear. "You're leaving me there." "That was the plan," he admitted, "but plans can change." "Don't leave me," she whispered, clutching Sadie tightly. "Please." Levi took a deep breath. "I've been thinking, what if we didn't go to the orphanage? What if, instead, I became your guardian, not pretending to be your father but caring for you all the same?" Hope dawned in her eyes. For real, for real. But it wouldn't be easy. I'd need to find steady work, a place for us to live." "We could go back to Promise Creek," Freya suggested eagerly. Miss Faith is there. The mention of Faith brought a warmth to Levi's chest. She is, isn't she? And she seemed to like you an awful lot. She likes you too, Freya said with the forthright honesty of a child. I saw her looking at you the way my mama used to look at my papa. Levi smiled despite himself. Is that so? Freya nodded solemnly. Can we go back, please? Looking at the town ahead and then back at the road they'd traveled, Levi made his decision. We need to make one stop in Cheyenne first. There are papers to sign to make everything official. But yes, Freya, we can go back to Promise Creek. The relief and joy on her face was all the confirmation he needed that he was making the right choice. 2 weeks later, as the first heavy snow of winter blanketed Promise Creek, Levi put the finishing touches on the small cabin he'd purchased on the edge of town. The previous owner had moved to California, leaving behind a solid structure that needed only minor repairs. With his carpentry skills revived, Levi had quickly made it habitable. The Robertson Ranch had been pleased to offer him year-round employment, impressed by his experience and work ethic. The arrangement allowed him to live in town rather than the bunkhouse, recognizing his responsibilities as Freya's guardian. As promised, he'd built her a simple dollhouse, which now occupied a place of honor in her small bedroom. Freya had begun attending faith school, thriving under the teacher's gentle guidance and the stability of her new life. Faith had become a regular visitor to their home, often joining them for supper and helping Freya with additional lessons. The friendship between them had deepened quickly, built on mutual respect and shared affection for the child who had brought them together. On this particular evening, as Freya slept soundly in her room, Levi and Faith sat before the fire, talking quietly about the day's events. She's writing her name now, Faith reported proudly. Her letters are improving every day. Thanks to you, Levi acknowledged. I don't know how to repay everything you've done for us. Faith's smile was warm, seeing her happy as payment enough and seeing you. She paused. You've changed since that first day, Levi. Have I? You smile more. There's a lightness to you that wasn't there before. He considered this. I suppose having something to live for changes a person. Their eyes met, and the understanding that had been growing between them seemed to crystallize into something more definite. Levi reached for her hand. Faith, I know it hasn't been long, but I feel like I've known you forever, being with you and Freya. It's like finding pieces of myself I thought were gone for good. Her fingers tightened around his. I feel it too. When you rode back into town with Freya, I felt like my prayers had been answered, prayers I hadn't even known I was saying. Levi moved closer. I can't offer much. Just a simple home and a heart that's learning to hope again. That's everything, Faith whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That's more than enough. When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long journey, gentle at first, then deepening with the promise of a shared future. When they finally parted, both were smiling. Does this mean you'll be my mama now? Came a small voice from the bedroom doorway. They turned to find Freya watching them, Sadie clutched in her arms and hope written across her face. Faith laughed softly. Not quite yet, sweetheart. These things take time, but someday, Freya pressed. Levi and Faith exchanged a look filled with promise. Someday, Levi agreed, if that's what we all want. Freya came to them then, climbing onto the sofa between them. I knew it, she said with satisfaction. I told Sadie that cowboys always find their happy endings. Levi put his arm around both of them, marveling at how a chance encounter and a child's innocent question had changed the course of his life. The grief that had defined him for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had made room for joy, a joy he'd never expected to find again. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Promise Creek in pristine white. But inside the small cabin, warmth prevailed, the warmth of a family being born from tragedy and hope, finding its way forward together. As spring arrived in Promise Creek, bringing with it new life and possibilities, Levi and Faith were married in a simple ceremony at the church where they'd first met. Freya stood beside them, officially becoming part of their family when Faith adopted her immediately after the wedding. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Levi eventually opened a carpentry shop in town, his reputation for quality work spreading throughout the territory. Faith continued teaching, though she took a brief respite when their son Lucas was born 2 years after their wedding, followed by twin daughters Emma and Alina the following year. Freya blossomed into a confident young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's resourcefulness. Though she never forgot her birth parents, she embraced the family that fate had given her with an open heart. On warm summer evenings, Levi would sometimes sit on the porch of their expanded home, watching Faith and the children in the garden. In those moments, he would remember a desperate whisper and tears he couldn't hold back the beginning of a journey he'd never planned, but wouldn't trade for all the gold in Wyoming. Every life, he'd learned, has its seasons of grief and joy. But sometimes, when you least expect it, a child's simple question can open the door to the greatest adventure of all, the adventure of loving again.